There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a Tuesday evening that feels like any other, a simple question asked without fanfare. They are the quiet hinges on which the door to the rest of your life swings open or shut. For me, that moment was the sound of a door left ajar, not closed, not open, but resting in a state of deliberate indecision, a question hanging in the silent air of my apartment. Julian's bedroom door. He had started leaving it that way a few weeks ago, a thin sliver of hallway light cutting across his floor, a silent invitation that was also a masterpiece of plausible deniability. If I walked past, if I did nothing, then it was just a door, carelessly left unlatched. But if I stopped, if I pushed it open and stepped inside, the meaning would change entirely. It was a choice he was leaving in my hands, a burden of intent he refused to carry himself, and every night it felt like holding my breath for a lifetime. Tonight, the silence was heavier. The rain that had been lashing against the windows for hours had finally softened to a persistent, melancholic drizzle, and the city outside was a watercolor blur of neon and asphalt. I stood in the hallway, the worn floorboards cool beneath my feet, and I stared at that sliver of light, that thin, golden line between friendship and something else. It was a boundary I had meticulously respected for years, a line I had drawn in my own heart to protect what we had. But he kept erasing it, night after night, with this one simple, devastating gesture. I could hear the soft, even rhythm of his breathing from the other room, a sound that had become the new metronome of my life. In out, a quiet tide pulling me toward a shore I was terrified to reach. I knew that if I walked into my own room and closed my own door, this fragile, unspoken thing between us might just evaporate with the morning light. He would emerge, stretch, run a hand through his perpetually messy hair, and offer me a tired, grateful smile that meant everything and nothing at all. We would make coffee, talk about his disastrous project at work, and the architecture of our friendship would remain intact, its foundations unshaken. But I was tired of the foundations. I was tired of the careful blueprints I had drawn to keep my own feelings contained. I wanted to feel the tremor, to risk the collapse, just to know if what we could build in its place might be truer. So I stood there, in the dim light of the hallway, and I made a choice. I took a breath, a real one this time, and I moved toward his door. Our story didn't begin in the charged silence of a hallway. It began under the sputtering orange glow of a streetlight in a torrential downpour. It was our freshman year of college, a lifetime ago. I was a photographer even then, or at least, I was a boy with an old camera and a desperate need to frame the world into something manageable. I saw things in compositions, in light and shadow, in the decisive moment. He was Julian. He wasn't a composition. He was a force of nature, a kinetic storm of energy and easy confidence that I, with my quiet watchfulness, found both intimidating and utterly magnetic. We were on the swim team together, a pairing that made little sense on the surface. I was a distance swimmer, all about measured pace and internal rhythm, finding a meditative state in the endless blue monotony of the lane. Julian was a sprinter, explosive power, a human thunderclap of muscle and will that lasted for less than a minute, but left the water churning in his wake. He lived in those bursts of intensity, and I lived in the long, quiet spaces in between. Our worlds were different textures, different tempos. That night, the storm had broken with biblical fury during our evening practice. The power had flickered and died, leaving the natatorium lit only by the emergency strobes and the ghostly, undulating light from the pool itself. Coach had called it, sending us out into a world that had turned into a river. I was huddled under a flimsy bus stop awning, my camera bag clutched to my chest like a prayer, trying to shield my ancient, non-weather-sealed camera from the deluge. The buses were running late, if at all. I was resigned to a long, damp wait, watching the rain blur the world into an impressionist painting. And then he was there, Julian. He came jogging through the downpour, laughing, his hair plastered to his forehead, his swim parka doing little to stop the soaking. He skidded to a halt under the awning, shaking his head like a wet dog and spraying water everywhere. He didn't seem to mind the cold or the wet. He seemed to be energized by it, as if the storm was just a more interesting form of weather. "You're gonna get washed away, Leo," he'd said, his voice bright and loud over the drumming of the rain on the plastic roof. It was one of the first times he had spoken to me directly, outside of a perfunctory good set at the end of a lane. I knew who he was, of course. Everyone knew Julian. He was the guy who organized the team dinners, the one who could make the stoic coach crack a smile, the one whose laughter echoed in the locker room. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets in his orbit. I mumbled something about waiting for the bus, my voice feeling small and inadequate. He just grinned, a flash of white in the gloom. "No way. The buses are screwed. My dorm's just a few blocks from here. Come on, we'll make a run for it. I've got a giant box of terrible instant mac and cheese that has your name on it." He didn't ask if I wanted to. He just stated it as a fact, a foregone conclusion. That was Julian. He created realities and invited you into them, and it was impossible to say no. So I ran with him, through the flooded streets, the cold rain a shock against my skin. We ran, splashing through puddles like children, and for the first time, I felt a spark of his chaotic energy transfer to me. In his world, a storm wasn't an inconvenience, it was an adventure. His dorm room was a monument to organized chaos, textbooks and clothes and swim gear in piles that seemed to have their own internal logic. He tossed me a dry towel and a ridiculously oversized university sweatshirt, and while I changed, he set about making the worst, most glorious mac and cheese I had ever tasted. We sat on his floor, eating straight from the pot, and we talked. Or rather, he talked, and I listened, and for the first time, it felt less like an interview and more like a conversation. He talked about the pressure of his scholarship, his family back home, his ridiculous fear of geese. He asked me about my camera, and when I hesitantly pulled it out, he didn't just glance at it. He took it, held it with a surprising reverence, and asked me to explain how it worked. He looked through the viewfinder, turning it around the room, and for a moment, he was quiet, seeing the world through my eyes. "It's so different in here," he'd murmured, his eyes still pressed to the camera. "Everything's still." That was the moment. That was the moment the tectonic plates of my neatly ordered world shifted. He saw the stillness I cultivated. He understood, without me having to explain, that my quietness wasn't emptiness. It was a different way of processing the world. From that night on, we were friends. An unlikely, symbiotic friendship. I became his anchor, the quiet space he could retreat to when the world got too loud. He became my bridge, the one who would gently pull me out of my shell and into the warmth of the sun. My feelings for him grew so slowly and quietly that I barely noticed them taking root. They were like a vine, wrapping themselves around the solid structure of our friendship, indistinguishable from it at first. It was in the small things. The way he'd always save me a seat on the bus to away meets. The way he'd bring me a coffee without asking, remembering exactly how I took it. The way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room, a quick, reassuring glance that said, "I see you. For years, I nurtured this secret garden inside me, tending to it in private." I told myself it was enough. Having him in my life as a friend was a gift I wouldn't risk for anything. He dated, of course, a string of bright, cheerful girls who were a much better match for his energy. I was the friend they all liked, the steady, reliable Leo who was always there. I learned to compartmentalize. I built walls inside myself, rooms where my affection for him was stored, locked away from the parts of my life he was allowed to see. I became an expert in the architecture of self-deception. It was a lonely way to live, but the alternative, a life without him in it at all, was unthinkable. The shift began on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were always stressful for Julian. His consulting firm had a standing weekly review that he described as a ritualized flaying. He'd usually call me afterward, buzzing with either the high of a successful presentation or the frantic, jagged energy of a dressing down. This particular Tuesday, the call never came. Instead, my doorbell rang at 10 o'clock at night. When I opened it, he was just standing there, his shoulders slumped, his usual vibrant energy completely extinguished. He was still in his suit, but his tie was loosened, his hair was a mess, and his face was pale with exhaustion. He looked like a city after a power failure, all the lights gone out. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at me, his eyes hollow. Can I? He gestured vaguely inside, unable to finish the sentence. I stepped aside without a word, and he shuffled past me, dropping his briefcase by the door with a heavy thud. He walked straight to my couch and collapsed onto it, burying his face in a cushion. The silence in the apartment was absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't press him. I knew that Julian processed his failures internally at first, turning them over and over until he could articulate them. I just went to the kitchen, made him a cup of the chamomile tea he secretly liked but would never admit to, and set it on the coffee table beside him. I sat in the armchair opposite, picked up a book, and pretended to read. I was simply holding space for him, creating a pocket of quiet where he could just be. An hour passed. He didn't move. The tea grew cold. Finally, he spoke, his voice muffled by the cushion. They pulled the plug. I knew which project he meant. The Keystone account. It had been his baby for 6 months, a massive, complicated software integration that he had poured every waking hour into. It was supposed to be his big promotion piece, the project that would launch him into the next phase of his career. What happened? I asked softly. He rolled over, his eyes red-rimmed. Everything. A junior analyst used the wrong data set for the initial projections. The client's internal team resisted the changes. My boss's boss got a call from their chief executive officer this morning. It's over. And it all lands on me. I was the project lead. He said it with a chilling flatness, a complete absence of his usual fire. He was just empty. He explained the brutal minutiae of the meeting, the corporate jargon that amounted to him being put on notice. He wasn't fired, but he was in a kind of professional purgatory, his future at the firm uncertain. As he talked, I saw a version of Julian I had never seen before. Not the charismatic swimmer, not the confident consultant. I saw a man who was profoundly lost and, for the first time in his life, genuinely scared. When he finally ran out of words, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling. The energy it had taken to explain had drained his last reserves. I could see the tremor in his hands. He looked too tired to even go home. Julian, I said, my voice steady. Stay here tonight. Don't worry about going back to your place. You can take the couch. He looked at me, and the gratitude in his eyes was so raw, so vulnerable, it almost hurt to see. Yeah? You sure? I'm sure, I said. Get some sleep. I grabbed the spare quilt and a pillow from the hall closet and set them on the end of the couch. He mumbled a thank you and curled up, pulling the quilt over himself without even bothering to take off his wrinkled suit pants. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the small lamp on my desk glowing, and went to my own room. I lay in my bed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in my living room. It felt strange, intimate. That was the first night. The night the foundation of our friendship developed a hairline crack, the first sign that the ground beneath us was beginning to shift. That first night bled into a ritual. It wasn't every night, but it became a regular feature of our weeks. After a particularly grueling day, my phone would buzz with a simple text. You around? It was a question, but we both knew it was a request. He'd arrive late, shed his corporate armor at the door, and gravitate toward my couch as if it were a magnetic pole. He said it was because my apartment was closer to his office and he was too tired to face the commute to his own sterile, empty condo. He said it was because my place was quiet, that the silence here was a different kind of silence, one that didn't feel like loneliness. I accepted these reasons because I had to, because they were the safe, plausible explanations that kept our friendship from becoming something fragile and undefined. I would make him tea, listen if he needed to talk, or just share the quiet if he didn't. And every time, he would fall asleep on the couch, exhausted and emotionally spent. The first time he crossed the threshold from the living room was about a month later. He'd had another terrible day, a follow-up meeting where his role in the failed project was dissected with surgical cruelty. He arrived at my door looking shattered, not just tired but broken in a way that scared me. He barely spoke, just nodded when I offered him tea and sat on the couch, staring into space. I left him alone, sensing he needed the solitude. I went to my room and worked on editing some photos, the repetitive clicks of my mouse a comforting rhythm in the tense quiet of the apartment. Around midnight, I heard a soft shuffling sound. I looked up to see him standing in my doorway. He was just standing there, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway, holding the pillow I always left for him. Leo. His voice was a whisper, so small I almost didn't hear it. Yeah. I swiveled in my chair to face him. The couch is. I don't know. It's too big tonight. Too empty, he paused, and I could feel the weight of what he was about to ask. Would it be weird if I just slept on the floor in here? My heart did a slow, painful lurch. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to say no, to gently redirect him back to the living room, to maintain the physical boundary that was keeping my sanity intact. But the look on his face, the sheer, unadulterated loneliness in his eyes, disarmed me completely. He looked like a child afraid of the dark. Don't be an idiot, Julian, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Don't sleep on the floor. The bed's big enough. It was out of my mouth before I could stop it. The offer hung in the air between us, shimmering with implications. For a second, I thought he would retreat, laugh it off as a joke. But he just nodded, a small, grateful dip of his head. He walked over to the far side of the bed, the side by the window, and lay down on top of the covers, still fully dressed in his t-shirt and sweats. He curled onto his side, facing away from me, and pulled the pillow over his head. I sat at my desk for another hour, my screensaver a swirling galaxy of colors, my mind a complete blank. I couldn't process what was happening. When I finally surrendered and got into bed, I lay ramrod straight on my own side, a chasm of several feet between us, terrified to even breathe too loudly. I felt the heat radiating from his body, a tangible presence in the cool air of the room. I did not sleep at all that night, and so the ritual evolved. The couch was forgotten. His new spot was the far edge of my queen-sized bed. He never brought it up in the morning. He would just wake up, thank me for letting him crash, and leave for work, the invisible line of our friendship seemingly redrawn by the morning light. But at night, the line would blur again. He started leaving a change of clothes at my place, a toothbrush in the bathroom. Small acts of domestic colonization that felt both wonderfully intimate and terrifyingly presumptive. He never asked. He just did them, and I never said a word. The space between us and the bed began to shrink. It happened incrementally, a slow, unconscious drift in the night. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find our shoulders barely touching, or his foot brushing against mine. Each touch was a small electric shock that jolted me from sleep, my mind racing to interpret the intent. Was it accidental, the simple physics of two bodies sharing a space? Or was it something more? I became a forensic analyst of sleep, studying the minute details of his unconscious movements for clues. Then came the door, my bedroom door. I'd always closed it, a habit from a lifetime of needing my own defined space. But one night, after he had fallen asleep, I got up to get a glass of water, and when I came back, I left it slightly ajar. I don't even know why I did it. It was an impulse, a subconscious test. The next night he stayed. He got into bed first while I was brushing my teeth. When I came back to the room, I saw that he had left the door ajar in exactly the same way. From then on, it was our new signal. The open door became the question, and my joining him in the room became the answer. It was a silent conversation we had every time he stayed, a way of asking for and granting permission without ever having to speak the terrifying words. The physical closeness escalated with the same glacial, undeniable pace. One night, I woke to find his arm draped over my waist. My entire body went rigid. I lay there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding against my ribs, dissecting the sensation. The weight of his arm was both a comfort and a torment. It felt like a brand, marking me as his. I could feel the warmth of his palm through my t-shirt, the slight pressure of his fingers against my side. I told myself he was asleep, that it was a reflexive, meaningless movement. But then, in the deep quiet of the room, I heard his breathing change, a subtle hitch, and I knew. He was awake. He was awake, and his arm was around me, and neither of us was moving, and neither of us was speaking. We were trapped in a shared moment of pretend sleep, both of us too afraid to acknowledge the truth of the gesture. The next morning, it went unmentioned, like everything else. But something had been broken open. The plausible deniability was wearing thin, stretched to the point of transparency. He began to initiate the contact, always under the guise of sleep. He would roll over and press his back against mine, a long line of warmth from shoulders to knees. Or he would shift, and his hand would land on my shoulder, his thumb stroking the fabric of my shirt in a slow, rhythmic pattern that he would pretend was just an unconscious twitch. I became hyper-aware of his every breath, every subtle shift in weight. My bed, once my sanctuary, had become a landscape of intense emotional and physical tension. It was a sweet kind of agony. I was closer to him than I had ever been, enveloped in his scent, his warmth, his presence. But it was a closeness built on a foundation of unspoken things, and I feared that if either of us ever spoke the truth, the entire structure would collapse into dust. I was living in a state of suspended hope, terrified that the slightest movement would send me plummeting. The ritual was our sanctuary and our prison, a beautiful, fragile cage we had built for ourselves, where we could be together without ever having to admit why. The night it all changed. The rain was back. It was a different kind of rain from the storm where we first met. Not a violent outburst, but a steady, weary weeping from a sky the color of slate. It had been a brutal week for Julian. The fallout from the Keystone Project had continued, a slow, bureaucratic poison seeping into every part of his work life. He felt like a ghost in his own office, people speaking in hushed tones when he walked by. He had come to my apartment straight from work, not even bothering to go to his own place first. He looked translucent, worn down to the very nub of himself. We ate dinner in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of our forks and the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. He didn't have the energy to talk about his day, and I didn't have the heart to ask. After dinner, he went to take a shower, and I cleaned the kitchen, my movements slow and deliberate. When he emerged, wrapped in one of my old, soft bathrobes, his hair dripping onto his shoulders, he looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. He bypassed the living room entirely and went straight to my bedroom. He left the door ajar. The invitation. I finished my tasks, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. I knew tonight felt different. The air was thick with a tension that had been building for months, a storm front of unspoken emotions ready to break. When I finally walked down the hall and pushed open his door, my door, he was already in bed, lying on his side, facing me. The only light was from the street lamp outside my window, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. He wasn't pretending to be asleep. His eyes were open, and they were fixed on me. I crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, my back to him. I couldn't meet his gaze. I could feel his presence behind me, a field of energy that made the air around me hum. We sat in that silence for a long time, the rain a constant, whispering companion. I was cataloging the sounds, the drip from the eaves, the distant sigh of traffic on wet pavement, the impossibly loud sound of my own breathing. I was terrified. I was convinced this was the night the spell would break, that he would tell me he couldn't do this anymore, that he had to go back to his own apartment, back to the safe, solid ground of our friendship. Leo. His voice was a rustle of dry leaves in the quiet room. It made me start. Yeah. I breathed, my eyes fixed on the way the rain traced paths down the window pane. Can I ask you something stupid? My stomach twisted. This was it. The question that would change everything. I braced myself. You can ask me anything, Julian. There was another long pause, and I could hear him take a shaky breath. Would it be okay, he began, his voice barely audible, hesitant and fragile. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The rain, the traffic, the world outside my window. It all dissolved into a dull, distant roar. The only thing that existed was his question, hanging in the space between us. It was so much more than a question about a kiss. It was a question about everything. About all the nights on the couch, all the silent moments in my bed, all the unspoken things that had been arcing between us like electricity. He was finally giving a name to the ghost that had been haunting my apartment for months. I turned around slowly, my body feeling like it was moving through water. He hadn't moved. He was still lying on his side, his expression a heartbreaking mixture of fear and hope. He was giving me the choice, placing all the power, all the risk in my hands. I could have said no. I could have laughed it off, made a joke, and preserved the careful fiction of our friendship. I could have saved us both from the terrifying, uncharted territory that lay on the other side of that question. But I was so tired of being safe. I didn't answer with words. I simply leaned forward, closing the small distance between us. His eyes fluttered shut as I drew closer. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, tentative, a question in itself. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand, but of discovery. It tasted of rain and salt and a deep, aching loneliness that I recognized as my own. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was an admission of a truth we had both been too cowardly to speak. I felt a tremor run through him, a sigh of surrender that seemed to come from the very core of his being. I brought my hand up to his face, my thumb tracing the line of his jaw, and he leaned into my touch, a silent affirmation. The kiss deepened, but it remained gentle, a slow, unfolding conversation. It was the most honest we had ever been with each other. In the quiet of my room, with the rain as our only witness, we had finally crossed the line, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we could never go back. And I didn't want to. The aftermath of a storm is a strange and silent thing. The world feels scrubbed clean, but also fragile, littered with the debris of what came before. That's what the next morning felt like. After the kiss, there were no more words. We had simply held each other, a tangle of limbs under the blankets, and for the first time, there was no pretense of sleep. It was a deliberate, conscious act of holding and being held. I fell asleep eventually, my face buried in the crook of his neck, his breathing a steady, reassuring rhythm against my ear. It was the deepest, most peaceful sleep I had had in months. But when I woke, the other side of the bed was empty. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I had dreamed it all. But the indentation on the pillow next to mine was still there, and the air still held the faint, lingering scent of him. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed for work, staring out the window at the gray, post-rain city. He was holding a mug of coffee, but he wasn't drinking it. He was so still, he looked like one of my photographs. When he heard me enter, he flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He didn't turn around. "Hey," I said, my voice thick with sleep. "Morning," he replied, his voice flat, neutral. It was a tone I hadn't heard him use with me in years. It was his work voice, his consultant voice. Polished, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. "Coffee?" I asked, moving toward the machine, trying to inject a note of normalcy into the suddenly charged atmosphere. "I have to go," he said, still not looking at me. "Early meeting." He placed his untouched mug in the sink, the ceramic clinking loudly in the silence. He grabbed his briefcase from by the door, and for a moment, I thought he was going to leave without another word. But he paused, his hand on the doorknob, his back still to me. "Leo," he said, his voice strained. "About last night. I was tired, and things have been a mess. I shouldn't have." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But I heard the words he didn't say. I shouldn't have done that. It was a mistake. He opened the door and was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet of my apartment with the ghost of his unspoken retraction. The silence he left behind was different from the comfortable quiet we used to share. This silence was hollow, accusatory. It echoed with the words mistake, tired, mess. I sank into a kitchen chair, the warmth and certainty of the night before evaporating like mist in the harsh morning light. I had let myself believe. For a few beautiful, rain-soaked hours, I had allowed myself to believe that the unspoken thing between us was real, that it was shared. And now, I was left feeling like a fool, like someone who had fundamentally misinterpreted every touch, every glance, every shared silence. I had built a cathedral of meaning out of accidental gestures and desperate loneliness, and he had just demolished it with a few careless words. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. He didn't call. He didn't text. The The nightly ritual was broken. My apartment felt cavernous, my bed impossibly large and cold. The door to my bedroom remained wide open, but it was no longer an invitation. It was just a doorway to an empty room. I tortured myself, replaying every moment of the past few months. Had I imagined it all? Was I just a safe harbor for him, a convenient place to weather his own personal storm? And in his desperation, had he offered a gesture he never meant? The thought was humiliating. It made me feel used, but worse than that, it made me feel pathetic for having wanted it so much. The anger came later. A slow, burning rage. How dare he? How dare he come into my space, into my bed, and make me feel that way, only to discard it as a symptom of his own stress? How dare he be so careless with me? After a week of agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I was oscillating between heartbreak and fury, and the inaction was eating me alive. I had to know. I needed to hear him say it to my face, to understand what had happened from his perspective, even if it was going to destroy me. I took the subway to his part of town, my hands clammy, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. His condo was in one of those new, soulless glass towers that had sprung up all over the city. I had only been there a handful of times. It was minimalist and impersonal, more like a hotel suite than a home. It was the perfect reflection of the part of his life he kept separate from me. He opened the door, and his face was a mask of surprise that quickly morphed into something that looked a lot like dread. He was wearing rumpled sweats, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Leo," he said, his voice rough. "What are you doing here? Are you going to let me in?" I asked, my own voice colder than I intended. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers littered the counter, and clothes were slung over the designer furniture. It looked like the home of someone who had given up. I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of his living room, my arms crossed, and I waited. "We need to talk about this, Julian," I said, breaking the tense silence. "You can't just kiss me like that and then disappear. You don't get to do that." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was deeply stressed. He wouldn't look at me. He paced over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city lights. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice low. "I told you. I was a mess. It was a mistake." "I'm sorry, a mistake?" The word came out sharper than I expected. "That's what it was? After all of it? All those nights? You in my bed? Was all of that just a mistake too? Was I just convenient? A warm body to keep the nightmares away?" My voice was rising, trembling with the force of a week's worth of pain and anger. "No, it wasn't like that," he finally snapped, turning to face me. His eyes were wild, cornered. "You don't understand? Then make me understand," I shouted, taking a step toward him. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used me. You used my friendship, my home, you used me to get through a rough patch. And now that you're feeling a little better, you're trying to shove it all back in a box and pretend it never happened. So, please, Julian, enlighten me. What don't I understand?" He deflated, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. He sank onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. His voice, when it came, was muffled and broken. "I don't know what I'm doing, Leo." It was a confession. "I've spent my whole life on a track. College, swim team, this job, the promotion. It's always been about the next step, the next goal. I knew who I was supposed to be. And then this project failed, and the whole track just disappeared. It was like I was running and suddenly there was no more ground beneath my feet." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "And you were the only solid thing in my life. Your apartment was the only place I felt like I could breathe. Being with you was the only time I wasn't thinking about what a failure I was." He took a ragged breath. "And it felt good. It felt right. Too right. And that scared the hell out of me." "Why?" I asked, my own anger softening into a painful confusion. "Why would that scare you?" "Because it's you," he exclaimed, a note of desperation in his voice. "You're Leo. You're my best friend. You're the most important person in my life. This feeling, it doesn't fit into any of the boxes. It doesn't fit on the track. I don't know what it is, and I don't know what to do with it. And I am so terrified of messing it up, of losing you, that my first instinct was just to run, to pretend it never happened, to put things back the way they were. I stood there, my heart aching for him, for his confusion, for his fear. He hadn't been using me. He had been terrified. Terrified of the same thing I had been for years. Risking the most important relationship in his life for something uncertain and new. He had panicked, retreated to what he knew, to the safety of denial. All my anger dissolved, replaced by a vast, bone-deep sadness for both of us, for all the time we had wasted being afraid. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet now. I walked over and sat down on the coffee table in front of him, so we were at eye level. "Look at me," he slowly lifted his head. "Putting things back the way they were. It's not an option anymore. We can't unkiss each other. We can't unfeel what we felt in that room. That door is closed." I reached out and took his hand. It was cold and clammy. "You're right. It is scary, and I don't know what this is either. But running away from it isn't the answer. We have to figure it out." Together, a single tear escaped his eye and tracked down his face. He didn't wipe it away. He just looked at me, his raw vulnerability laid bare. "I don't want to lose you, Leo." "You won't," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Whatever this is, we start from here. No more running. No more pretending. Just this." I squeezed his hand, and for the first time in a week, he squeezed back. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. It was a promise to stop running and finally face the beautiful, terrifying truth that had been living between us all along. The new beginning was quieter than I would have imagined. There was no grand cinematic moment, no dramatic declarations. It was built, instead, in a series of small, intentional acts of honesty. After our confrontation in his apartment, he came back to my place with me. He didn't bring a bag. He didn't have a plan. He just followed me home, as if tethered by an invisible string. That night, when we got into my bed, the familiar space felt entirely new. There was no chasm between us, no pretense of accidental touch. He turned to face me in the dark, and I met his gaze. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the curve of my ear, the line of my neck. It was a deliberate exploration, a mapping of new territory. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the space between us. "I'm so sorry I hurt you." "I know," I whispered back. "I was scared too, and that was it. An apology and an acceptance. It was all we needed." We didn't kiss again that night. Instead, he pulled me closer until my head was resting on his chest, his arms wrapped securely around me. I could feel the steady, reassuring thump of his heartbeat beneath my ear, a rhythm that was both new and deeply familiar. For the first time, the closeness wasn't a source of anxiety or a puzzle to be solved. It was simply a comfort, a fact. It was the quiet, solid foundation of whatever we were building now. We were learning a new language together, one spoken not in grand pronouncements, but in the grammar of touch, in the syntax of shared silence. The days that followed were a process of gentle recalibration. We started talking, really talking. We unraveled years of unspoken feelings, of misinterpreted gestures. I told him about the night we met in the storm, how I'd felt a pull toward him even then. I confessed how I had carefully compartmentalized my feelings for him for years, convinced that our friendship was the only form our relationship could ever take. He listened, his expression a mixture of surprise and a kind of sad recognition. He, in turn, talked about his own loneliness, a deep, pervasive feeling he had always masked with activity and ambition. He admitted that his relationships had always felt performative, like he was playing a role he thought he was supposed to play. He said that with me, in the quiet of my apartment. He felt like he could finally take off the costume, that he didn't have to be the charismatic sprinter or the hotshot consultant. He could just be Julian. His things began to migrate from his sterile condo to my apartment, not through a process of colonization this time, but through a series of conversations. A box of books appeared on my shelf. His favorite coffee mug found a permanent home next to mine. One Saturday, we went to his place and packed up half his wardrobe. As we worked, a comfortable domesticity settled around us. We put on music, ordered pizza, and folded his shirts, our hands occasionally brushing. Each touch was a small, quiet affirmation. This is real. This is happening. The door to my bedroom was now always closed at night. Not left ajar as a question, but firmly, intentionally shut. It was no longer a boundary to be tested, but a statement of privacy, of shared space. It was the door to our room. The world outside could be loud and chaotic. His work could still be a source of stress, but inside that room, we had carved out a sanctuary. Our nights were no longer filled with the tension of unspoken things. They were filled with whispered conversations in the dark, with the simple, profound comfort of falling asleep and waking up next to the person you trusted most in the world. He still had bad days at work, but now, when he came home, he didn't collapse on the couch in silence. He found me, wrapped his arms around me from behind while I was making dinner, and just held on, burying his face in my shoulder. And I would lean back into him, a silent promise that he was not alone in the storm. He was home. One rainy Sunday afternoon, months later, we were lying on the couch, tangled together under a blanket, reading. The light was gray and soft, and the only sound was the turning of pages and the familiar patter of rain on the window. It was a perfect, ordinary moment. Julian put his book down on his chest and looked at me, a small, thoughtful smile on his face. "What?" I asked, lowering my own book. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble. "About that first night. The storm. You were standing under that bus stop, trying to protect your camera." He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. "You looked so serious. So focused on protecting this one fragile thing from the whole world." He paused, his gaze soft and full of a gentle warmth that still made my heart ache in the best possible way. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've been trying to get back under that awning with you ever since." And in that moment, I understood. All the chaos, all the confusion, all the fear, it had all been part of his long, winding journey back to that small, sheltered space. He wasn't the storm. He was just lost in it, looking for a place to be still. And I wasn't just the quiet observer. I was the harbor. I was the anchor. I was the one who knew how to make a home in the quiet spaces. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The world outside didn't disappear. Its storms still raged, but they no longer had the power to break us. We had found our center in each other. The space between us was no longer a fragile, unspoken question, but a quiet, confident answer. It was a home, built not on grand gestures, but on the steady accumulation of small, true moments. It was the peace of a hand finding yours in the dark. It was the comfort of a shared blanket on a rainy day. It was the certainty of a closed door. It was the simple, profound relief of finally, truly being seen.